Our brains are amazing. And so, what we're going to talk about today is flying on autopilot. And this is a term I use to refer to our tendency to navigate the world day to day without really thinking about it. We believe our actions are aligned with our good intentions, but the majority of what we do, excuse me, every day, all day, is just based on patterns and we've learned and developed and honed to the point where we can do them without thinking, on autopilot. Now, the goal today isn't to, or anytime you do unconscious bias training, the goal is not to eliminate bias, but it's really about increasing awareness of how these unconscious processes are happening that then influence our decision making and our thinking and our actions. And this awareness can help us recognize how that bias might impact others, how then we might impact others, and then how stereotypes and assumptions can ultimately lead to discrimination, exclusion, and marginalization. And our goal is to create more inclusive workplaces and equitable workplaces. So that's why this is so important to understand. Right now, I will be taking questions as we go along, and I say that as I try to navigate the Q&A. So I've asked Beryl to let me know if I'm missing some questions in the queue, but please go ahead and put them in and I'll try to cover them as much as I can as we go along. So who am I? I'm Jana Etienne. I am CEO of Etienne Consulting. Our firm helps organizations identify and then implement DEI initiatives, incorporate or integrate DEI into training and learning and development programs. And we also offer coaching to help leaders and business executives lead inclusive organizations and high-performing teams that support diverse talent in meaningful ways through self-awareness, intentionality, and mindfulness. After a 26-year career in public accounting, I shifted to D&I work, and my work focuses on inclusive leadership, conscious communications, cultural sensitivity and awareness, empowering authenticity, and fostering belonging. So we are going to start. I want to set the stage. I'd like to get a sense of how many are familiar with today's topic. So let's launch that first poll.
All right, that poll is launched and live. We do leave each poll open for about 60 seconds so you can get your votes logged in.
While you all are taking the poll, there was a question that came in before we went live, actually. And the question was asking if I was going to go over the distinction between the id, ego, and superego. I think I got that right. And the answer to that question is maybe. I will say I've not done the in-depth research about those definitions as it relates to the conscious and subconscious and unconscious that I'm going to talk about. But I hope I cover that. So we'll see if my language is aligned with those expectations. So I'm seeing here we're almost done with the poll.
We are. I'm going to go ahead and close this one down in 3, 2, and 1. Share out the results real quick. There you go, 53%, somewhat familiar.
And 20% not very familiar. And 10%, this is all new to me. So thank you for joining me. And by the way, Joseph, you're an Arsenal fan and we are top of the table. We are taking it this year. For those of you who follow the English Premier League, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So I wanted to start with this quote. This quote is, the mind is like an iceberg. It floats with 1/7 of the bulk of its bulk above water. This is from Sigmund Freud, an Austrian neurologist, often called the father of modern psychology. And it is his framework around unconscious and how we unpack what's happening deep within. So that's what we're going to look at. And in fact, ta-da, I decided to stick with the iceberg theme. And I tried to find a picture matching this 1/7 above water thing. And so there's only a small portion that's visible above the surface. And I'm going to call that our conscious mind. And this is the part of the mind that's aware of our surroundings. It's responsible for our perceptions and interpretations of the world around us. If you're aware of it right now, it's in your conscious mind. So this includes what we're thinking about right now, whether it's front of mind or even sort of lingering in the background. So our short-term memory, we're holding things there. And this is where we're constantly scanning for information. We're looking to see what's happening so that we can process it, judge its relevance, assign it some meaning, perceive what's happening, reason, judgment, learning, talking, engaging, and expressing emotionally. All of these things happen in our conscious mind. However, it is limited in its capacity and can only process a limited amount of information at any given time. It's also influenced by our biases and those processing shortcuts. And as a result, that's what can lead to errors in judgment and perception. So now just below the waterline is our subconscious. Now this part of our brain is scanning for the information from our conscious mind, and then it's engaging in a more complex pattern recognition. It's where we process and store our emotions. It's where we feel intuition. It's what gives us a sense of motivation. And what we can recall with relative ease, we call those memories. And memories are just part of our subconscious mind. This is where they are stored. Now, they can be actively drawn out. They can be awakened by an experience or even a smell. Do you know smell is the strongest memory that we have? This part of the brain is also responsible for sounding the alarm when it thinks there's potential danger or threat. So hold that thought. Now, the last thing is that the subconscious mind can be influenced by a number of biases like cultural and societal conditioning. Note that. And so that's what can lead to some automatic behaviors that we aren't necessarily conscious of. Deep below the waterline is our unconscious. And so over our lifetime, from childhood and on, we are collecting this vast repository of information that ultimately form our beliefs, our fears, the insecurities we carry today. And that database is driving what we are currently doing without us thinking much about it. These are our deep-rooted beliefs, for example. We can't access this information unless you go through this techniques like hypnosis, guided therapy, all of those things that we've heard about that Freud talked about. So those are the 3 levels of consciousness. We have what's currently in our brain, what's right below we have what we're actively aware of right now, what's just below that we can pull up, memories and things like that. And then there's the stuff that's deep within that form our values and our beliefs, but we're not aware of what's happening in that part of our brain day to day, minute to minute. All right, so now in the context of bias, I want us to look at the 3 sections of our brain. There are a lot more than these 3, but I've organized it to simplify things into 3. So the first part here is pink, or I think it might even be purple on your handout. Now this part is called the lizard brain, and that's because it's the most primitive part of the brain. It's shared by all reptiles, and this is what regulates our heartbeat, our breathing, our body temperature. And it's also the part that's responsible for instinctual or reflexive behaviors. And one of the things that's important in terms of the way you can think about what it does is it's really relying on instinct and not reason. The focus here is survival and reproduction above all else. Now, in the middle part of our brain, the green part of our brain, the part that I color-coded green here is the mammal brain. And this is a more complex structure in the brain, and it's found in all mammals. It's responsible for regulating our emotions, for memory, for motivation, for social behavior. There are a lot of structures that come together in this part of the brain that are collectively referred to as the emotional nervous system. This is also where the amygdala lives, and the amygdala is important because when our body is scanning for what's going on and processing those emotions, what the amygdala does is it's scanning for threats. And if a threat is detected, it rings a bell and activates a response. Now I'm going to use a fire station as an example. So firefighters are just hanging out, they're waiting for a call. Meanwhile, they're making sure their gear is ready so that when a call comes in, they can react immediately. So an alarm goes off, they spring into action. They race to the fire, and then they have to quickly assess the situation, create a plan of action, and then execute it. Well, in that example, the amygdala is the actual ringing of the bell. The spring into action and run off, that's what's being managed by the reptilian complex. And fun fact, did you know that the National Fire Protection Association standard turnout time is 60 seconds for EMS and 80 seconds for a fire? I found that kind of reassuring. All right, so then the last part of our brain is the blue part that I've coded here, the neocortex. And this is only found in humans and other higher mammals. This is responsible for language, abstract reasoning, task switching, spatial awareness, decision making. The neocortex determines if you want to do something. The limbic system, or green, is how you feel about doing that something. And in the fire station example, this is the part of the brain, the neocortex, that's developing the plan of action, that's actually evaluating the scene. So how does this all come together then? What does it look like? Well, something happens. And when that thing happens, we have our limbic system, the green part of our brain, attaching feelings, establishing memories, dropping some anchors, if you will. I show the reptilian complex here, the red, because it could be triggering a biological response, the fight, flight, or freeze reaction. Then you have the blue part of our brain. And what the blue part of our brain is trying to understand what is happening. This is the conscious process that we're aware of in the moment. Whatever we're thinking about, whatever we're trying to figure out, or we're simply observing, or at least we think we're objectively observing, but there's often more happening behind the scenes. Think of it this way. The blue part of the brain is creating the memories. The green part of the brain is storing the memories. Now, here's where it gets interesting, and this is how bias happens. Because over time, those feelings change, they're influenced by other things. There may be hidden messages, the media, for example. We ultimately end up gaining what we think is a better understanding, books, media, experiences, good and bad. And eventually, it gets us to the point where we can fly on autopilot. It gets us to the point where we can just see and do, and we don't really have to think because those patterns are ingrained. All right, next polling question. Seems random, but have you ever driven to work and you don't remember the drive? All right, this one I'm always interested in hearing about.
All right, I did launch that poll. There is a question in the questions panel. Are you able to see it, Jana?
When you're presented, that one?
Yes.
All right, so yes, it says, when you presented your background, are you trying to invoke our unconscious biases to trust you? That's interesting. No, I wouldn't say unconscious. I was hoping that not trust, but that you would understand that my background is sufficient and justifies me doing this presentation. So that's a really good question. And unconscious bias would be leaning into a perception so that that perception tied to me can create trust. This one was very explicit. All right, so 79% so far, or it looks like we'll close the poll now. So 79% can remember, can drive and not remember driving. So here's why I was asking about it. So I just thought this was a cute question. How do we learn to drive? First, we get comfortable in the driver's seat. We learn the controls. We understand which does what. Then we practice. We practice the basic maneuvers. We practice driving in different conditions. We practice and plan for different scenarios. And then we practice some more, and we practice some more, and we practice some more until we're ready to take the driver's test. Now, at the beginning of this, we're present, we're highly alert. I don't know how the brake and the clutch and the gas, how hard do you hit the gas pedal in order to, not do that. But by the end of all of this, we're absent-minded. We're on automatic pilot. Yes, we're driving without thinking about it. So how does this happen? Well, 95% of what we do every day, 95% is automatic. Now, keep your eyes on the screen, keep your fingers in the Q&A, because over the next couple of sections, I'm actually going to do a couple of tests, and I would love to get your responses. And I do know that there's a bit of a delay between when you type a question and I see it, so there might be some delay for me responding. But look at this. Okay. First thing I want you to do here is I want you to tell me which line is longer, the one at the top or the one on the bottom. Okay. Got your fingers ready? All right, here, let me show you the lines. Which is longer, the one on the top or the one on the bottom? All right, so I see some answers coming in already. Someone is saying the same, top, bottom. So far, bottom is winning. Those of you who I think know the answer, I'm ignoring you. You're gonna give it away. But I see neither. Bottom, bottom, bottom. Hi from San Antonio. Bottom, 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 same. All right, well, those of you who have answered the same, you are right. Because let me show you, watch this. I'm gonna move the slide forward. You'll see I took those little points away, and you can see going back and forth, the only difference are the arrows. And when the arrows are pointing inward, it gives the sense of an elongated line. And this is called, what is this called again? The Muller-Lyer illusion. And it was discovered or created back in the 1800s. So anyway, I just thought it was very interesting because your brain is trying to process this. All right, next test. I'm going to need you to pull out a timer. I usually use the timer thing on my phone. And you're just going to want to be able to track it in seconds. I'm going to give you a second because you're going to need a stopwatch. So when I show you what's on the screen, let me give you the instruction. I'm giving you a second to pull out your timer. All right. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a group of words. I want you to name the colors of the word. Don't read the word. Focus on the color of the word. It might actually help to say this out loud. Mumble if you're not in a private space. Whisper quietly. Now, once I flip the slide to the next slide, start your timer and start naming out the colors of the word. You ready? Set. Okay, go. So how'd you do? I can tell you that when I did this the first time, it took me about 6 seconds. So I'm not sure how everyone did. Let me see if I can't. There are a lot of questions in the queue that are coming in. 10 seconds, 7 seconds, 6.64. Okay, 6.64 seconds. Really? That specific? I know, I appreciate you. All right, so 7, 6, 7, 8. We're all hovering above and below 6 or 7 seconds. All right, now reset your timer because we're going to do it again. Now that you know how the game is played, set your timer. Ready? I'm going to do it one more time. Don't read the word. Don't say the word. Name the color that you see. Ready? Set? Go. All right, how'd you do? I will tell you that the second time around, it took me about 13 seconds. This is called the Stroop effect. And this is really about cognitive interference. You know, I was talking about the blue part, the neocortex, and task switching. Well, this exercise gives you conflicting information because the word blue might be in the ink color yellow. And our conscious brain can only handle so much information at a time. This is why you can become mentally fatigued and start to lose focus or productivity as the day wears on. I just came back from a conference, and if any of you have ever been in a conference and you were engaged in all of the sessions over the course of the day, networking at lunch, at the networking reception in the evening, and then you go back to your hotel room and you're exhausted, it's because your brain cannot maintain this kind of focus for long periods of time. Okay, another fun fact. Oops, sorry. Did you know that during a tournament, a chess player might burn a chess tournament as much as 6,000 calories a day, all while simply thinking? This is real energy burning, people. All right, so other things about the automatic brain. Reactions that you might have will influence what you think you're seeing or how you might react to something in the future. So the environment, the mood, the language that you hear that is ultimately tied to or might reinforce a stereotype, past experiences, good or bad. Our automatic brain is using all of this content and these factors to influence perhaps how we're reacting. Now, can you change all of this? Yes, we can interrupt automatic behaviors, but it involves all of these different systems in our brain. This ability to change is something called neuroplasticity. And so if we engage in new activities, we learn new skills, or we create conscious connections, we can pave those new neural pathways so that those patterns of automatic, is it automatic, automaticity? Those automatic patterns can start to change. Remember, unconscious bias training isn't about becoming not biased. Biased is a brain function of that process that we need because we cannot handle too much consciously. But what we can try to do here is through awareness, we can try to change some of those processes so that the automatic response starts to lean closer to our intention. It's also about understanding the impact we might be having at any given time. So Beryl, are you saying there's a question that I should?
There's a couple of questions. Is it okay to interrupt with those?
Absolutely. Now, how do I find them? Because my
One of them may have come off your screen, so I'm just going to go ahead and read it out loud. Someone was asking how perception impacts those affected by, and I think this is a typo, it says ACHD. I'm guessing he meant ADHD.
So, that's a really interesting question. ADHD is one of the various different ways that our brains wire information differently, process information differently. That's called neurodiversity. And that can influence what we see. And think about it, let me think of another one, dyslexia or dyscalculia. This is, the words are there, but our brain is reversing the letters or the numbers. So it isn't directly tied to unconscious bias, but when our brains are processing information, it's just a question of how it's then laying those anchors. So I think I answered that question, right?
Yep. The other question was related to the task that you just had us do, and somebody was asking if it's cheating to unfocus my eyes so I don't get distracted by the word.
Okay, so that's a good trick. Actually, I did the same thing. And if that's a strategy that works for you, what you've done is you've identified a way to interrupt what would otherwise be a really difficult automatic process. And so that's a good strategy. I kind of like it. And okay, so let's come back. Remember that process earlier? Well, let's look at it as we click through what it then looks like when you pull it all together. So this is how something goes from initial exposure to ingrained pattern. So boom, 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 boom. It all just happens, just like that. And in fact, here's another way to look at it. Because you can ignore all of this, because when we are flying on autopilot, Just like our brain likes to create shortcuts, this is what it looks like visually. Something happens, autopilot kicks in, your brain directs traffic, you do the thing. 95% of the time, you're not aware of the thing. And autopilot says, this happened, this is what we do. This happened, this is how we respond. I see this, this is the way I react to this. Flying on autopilot. This process is called unconscious bias. Now, how does it manifest itself? Well, there are a lot of different types of biases. They can influence our mental processes in a number of different ways. We don't know the exact number of biases. Some are more common. And in fact, so you see all of these on the screen. I'm going to give you definitions for all of these. You have the handout. They're all in the handout. And I'll give you some examples for some that are a little bit more common that we see in business. We don't have time to go through this in depth. The goal of today's session is awareness of bias and then understanding how that bias influences our brain. It's not supposed to be a deep dive and really understanding each of the individual biases. All right, so next polling question, let's start there. How familiar are you on the biases on this list? So let me go back to the list. Are they all new to you? A few are new to you, or you know all of them? So I'm going to leave this up here. I don't know if
The
you can see it.
audience, they won't be able to see it until the poll question closes, but it is in the handout, correct?
Yes, it's in the handout. Maybe. I don't think there's a way to put that in the question, is there?
There is not, as far as like the image, no.
So
Lauren's asking if you're able to read them. I honestly didn't see how many are on that list for them to be
I'll
read.
read them out loud. Confirmation bias, perception bias, name bias, affinity bias, attractiveness bias, conformity bias, height bias, age bias, halo and horns, and gender bias. Those are all the things that are on the slide.
Great. It looks like we have most of the answers in. Timothy's asking how common is name bias, but I'll go ahead and close the poll now and then let you answer that question. All right, here are your results.
So 27% new to me, 41% a few, 17% one or two. Okay, well, this is good. So we have a nice mix. Now, how common is one over the other? Kind of hard to say. Yes.
We're in, the poll question is stuck on screen. I'm going to
Stop share, reshare?
Yeah, if you can unshare and reshare.
Okay, did I stop share?
You did?
Am I resharing?
We are good now.
All right. I have my monitor turned. I can't see what you can see, so it's not a distraction. What was the question?
The question was, how common is name bias?
How common is name bias? So it's interesting that you asked that, and we'll get to that when we get to that on the slide. But all of these are going to fall into the famous accounting question that the answer you can have for every accounting question, and that is, it depends. So let's walk through these. First, we have gender bias. Gender bias is a tendency to prefer one gender over another, treat one more favorably over another, also called sexism. And it really has influences on a number of different things. This is a fundamental challenge that we have, especially because we are in a gendered society. And primarily everything in our country and in our society is organized around two genders, male, female. There's a spectrum in between that we generally don't recognize, even though biologically there is something called intersex, for example, which is a human body that has genitalia that and the underlying hormones that are both male and female. Hard to imagine because that's an example, rarity. So here's an example. A male employee is given more leadership opportunities than his female counterparts, even though his female counterparts have similar qualifications, skills, and work experience. Not uncommon. I actually wrote a blog, if you're interested. It's live yesterday on Canopy, and it's really about trying to finally and for once and for all break down some of these gender biases by collectively working on our language. All right, the next one is affinity bias, and this is gravitating toward people who share similarities. It's sometimes called the likes, like bias. There's a lot of likes. Basically, people who we have something familiar with, we lean into. So a manager has a personal connection with an employee on their team. Maybe they share a common interest, like Joseph and I with the Arsenal Football Club. It leads to potentially the manager favoring that employee when it comes to decision making, maybe assigning them to a primo high profile project. The next one is halo and horns. And the halo and horns is where you can have a positive or a negative first impression that then lingers. So a manager gives an employee an excellent performance review based on one project. They then tend to maybe overgeneralize and give this employee continued higher marks in performance reviews, even if their performance is struggling, or they might actually be underperforming. Horns is the exact opposite. Somebody struggled on their first project, and so now it's harder to raise up the perception of that employee. They've got a lot of hurdles to jump. And interestingly enough, a negative first impression is harder to reverse and get to be higher and higher. So this is a challenging one. Halo, good first impression. Horns, not so good first impression. Either one, it lingers with you over time. Conformity bias is also referred to as peer pressure. And this is driven by our pressure to fit in, to be part of the group. None of us want to be isolated and alone. Humans are pack animals. We are not designed to be alone. And so this is the tendency then to change the way we act or behave, regardless of what we believe, in order to fit in. So a team member doesn't speak up in a meeting, even though they disagree with the rest of the team. They're conforming to the group opinion to avoid conflict. Hold that thought. Group opinion, hold that thought. I love that this one is called the granddaddy of them all, the confirmation bias. This is us scanning for the things we favor, scanning for the things that validate our beliefs, and dismissing everything else. And so, in other words, we are looking for confirmation of what we already believe to be true. And as a result, we tend to favor those who share those beliefs. So, for example, a hiring manager is looking for a candidate. They think they need to have a skill in a particular technology in order to be successful. So when they're reviewing resumes, they're looking specifically for people who have worked with that technology, even though they might not otherwise have all the attributes and skills, and ignoring what might be really highly qualified candidates because they don't specifically list that technology. Other types of bias, this is the question that came up earlier, name bias, which is where we favor names from our own culture. One of the things we know from data and analysis and research that has been done in this country in particular, Black and African American names are less likely to be selected for an interview. It could also manifest in a way because I might lean away from a colleague or prospective recruit because their name is difficult to pronounce. Age bias is also called ageism, and it means we're prejudiced against a particular group. And this goes both ways. Somebody can be we perceive elderly, or they can be too young and not have enough experience. Height bias, too tall or too short based on the acceptable height in our culture tends to negatively impact men more than women. Attractiveness bias. This is attributing positive attitudes to somebody that we believe is attractive, highly subjective, often around what the prescribed norms are for that culture. So it's going to be a little bit different culture to culture. And it can result in unfair treatment for those who don't conform to conventional beauty standards. Think about those who are transgender or express gender that is different than their biological gender assignment. That doesn't mean they're necessarily lesbian or gay. It's just a question of how they express their internal identity. And so what's interesting about that is this is an example where beauty and even height could be have a negative impact on the way we filter them. And then there's more. There's a weight bias. There's what's called the leniency effect, where we might want to be soft on somebody or not overly criticize, say, a candidate because, hey, if they're going to work for us, we don't want them to not like us. And so we're going to be lenient because we want to make sure that we're protecting that relationship. So we talked about bias. We talked about how our brain creates these automatic processes. And there's so much that we learn, feel, and then it becomes deeply ingrained, from conscious to subconscious to unconscious. So now I want to look at some examples of, we did look at some examples. Why is it important that we want to understand these impacts? If left unchecked, these biases can lead to discrimination, inequitable treatment, missed opportunities for growth or promotion. For those who feel that they have been marginalized, discriminated against, or things are unfair or inequitable, decreased productivity, increased absenteeism, higher turnover. So we want to tie everything together now and take a practical look at how this shows up day to day. I do see some questions in here, so let me see if there
are quite a few. Some comments coming in too.
I want to make sure that my filter is correct. If you're tagging them all, then I will see them because they're at the top.
I tagged some with flags for you.
Okay, that'd be great. Is there such a thing as accent bias? Absolutely. And in fact, we tend to see people who have an accent or are an immigrant as less competent and less, what's the word? It's along the line of competent. They aren't as smart, less intelligent. Thank you, Jana. So that is definitely a bias. What's interestingly enough is that we have accents around the country and some accents are favored more than others. That's a little bit not exactly the same as a bias over the accent itself when you're an immigrant. Why would gender bias be different for a white male or any other race male? Oh, so gender bias is not necessarily about race, it's about gender. Men might be seen as assertive, a woman might be seen as bossy. And so that is the bias that we're talking about, that because of a gender, we tend to prescribe attributes, make assumptions about a person. Bias. So going back to my background question, why tell us about your husband, kids, and dog? Doesn't that evoke the heterosexual norm bias? No, that isn't. I'm not trying to trigger a bias. This is, we get to know each other. We share information about ourselves. It's not the sharing. It's really about how all of us are going to react to that without realizing that we're reacting to that. Remember, unconscious bias is about how we are processing information in the background and we're not aware of that processing. And as a result, we might make decisions. Things might come out of our mouth. We might gestures or things like that that could be expressing what is unconsciously wired into us, even though our conscious mind thinks we're doing something differently or intends to do something differently. All right, so we're going to do one last test. Now this one's quick. What I want you to do is I want you to tell me, look at these two faces and tell me which person is more competent, the person on the left or the person on the right. Watch quickly. Okay, ready? Yeah, that wasn't that much time. But as it would turn out, all you need to make that decision is the duration of a blink of an eye. So what was your conclusion? Let's see, person on the left or person on the right? Let me see what the answers are coming in. I think I have these set up. Oops, I might be deleting some questions. I apologize. So since I'm having difficulty with the queue, I apologize, folks, but I will tell you, most people will say it's the person on the left. Let me go forward. The person on the left. Studies have told us that certain facial features have us feeling that somebody might be more or less trustworthy, like are their eyes close together, are the corners of their mouth curled up or down. And research, there was a research team in University of York. They showed 1,000 pictures randomly selected off of the internet to 6 volunteers. They were asked to rate their first impressions based on social traits like trustworthiness and dominance. And these pictures ranged from everyday scenes, different angles, different lighting, different ages, different expressions, hairstyles, and so on. And what they found was that mouth shape was linked to approachability. Eye shape was linked to a sense of youthfulness and attractiveness. Eye size, relatively large eyes, youthful. And then dominant, strong features evoked thoughts or indications of masculinity. So it was interesting. So what do we notice then when we see somebody? In this order, we notice race, or what we perceive to be somebody's race, gender, or what we think is somebody's gender, or age. And you know what? We've all learned, don't tell somebody how old you think they are. Because what we know is often we get these things wrong. I mean, the 2 most painful, cringe-worthy comments that I've made in this area, and some of you might have done this, so when is the baby due? Or worse, my neighbor, I said, oh, your grandchildren are beautiful. No, those are my kids. Oh, so first impressions are important to understand. What do we see? What do we assess somebody to be? And in fact, you're going to see this in the handout. There's a whole list of types of features and the first impression it likely leaves on us. So let's talk about then how this looks. Something happens, we see somebody, an event happens, something is said, something is done, something happens to me, I have an immediate reaction. When I'm having that reaction, this part of my brain is feeling emotionally what's going on. And oftentimes those emotions are driving my reaction. I'm not analyzing the data, I'm not doing critical reasoning. And as a result, the things that come out of my mouth, the decisions I make, the behaviors I exhibit might actually be unconscious, non-conscious, which is often then unintended. Because this is where, if you've ever said, that's not what I said, or that's not what I mean, this might have been what happened. You said something because the emotions were driving what you said without the logic. This shows up in a lot of places like recruiting. I mentioned those examples earlier. Promotion, I mentioned those examples earlier when we were looking at bias. Pay equity, we know that there's something called the pay gap. Women generally make, I want to say it's like 83 cents on the dollar than men, and women of color even less on the dollar. Higher instances of harassment. Bias might be behind some of these challenges in terms of the systems in our organizations. But then it's also involved in team dynamics. We have things like groupthink, unwritten rules, which are, think the boys club, the boys network, or the girls club. Only people, or fraternities and sororities, people in that group know the rules. The rest of us don't necessarily get all of the rules to be successful in a particular place. You have assimilation strategies where people will start to adopt different strategies to fit in, to conform based on the culture and feelings of either discrimination or marginalization. We want to fit in. This one in particular, groupthink, is when people start to just think as a unit in order to make decision making go faster. Essentially, it's a normal thing. It happens all the time. We want to see and we want to reach consensus. The challenge is when you start to see things like that person's young, they probably don't have enough experience, so we're going to discount their contributions. That kind of thing is what can start to show up when bias is involved and there's a group dynamic. So how do we switch this? And I'm looking at the time, so I want to make sure we have enough time because I see some questions queuing up. How do we interrupt all of this? We've got a bunch of people in the room, peer pressure to not say anything, somebody who feels like, I'm the smartest person in the room, so I'm the one that should really be leading this discussion. Or the unwritten rule, I'm trying to think of one. When I started at Touche, anytime my senior invited me to lunch, it was expected that the senior was going to pay for lunch. So the highest ranking person, when you invited somebody else to lunch, if the person over you invites you to lunch, they're paying. That was an unwritten rule. So if they didn't pay, you'd be sort of shocked. So how do we get out of this? Well, one book I would recommend to read is this book. It does a wonderful job of explaining how these hidden biases or blind spots can be driving our behavior and we're not aware of them. And I do want to make a comment about the title blind spot, because for some, as we start to understand ableist language and disability exclusion, different ability exclusion, some might find this term offensive. On the other hand, there's actually a thing called a blind spot where there are parts of our peripheral vision we can't see, which makes for some saying, how can this be offensive? So I just want to acknowledge that the title of this book is being used to describe a bias and not that peripheral blind spot. And as a result, I can understand how in this case, it's the equivalent of saying something like, turning a blind eye, or you're being tone deaf. We're using ableist language in a way that can be disparaging or dismissive. And that's what we were trying to avoid. But anyway, great book. I would certainly recommend it. How do we interrupt this? I want to say this is this simple, but it's actually not this simple. But the idea is to notice when it is happening. So how can you notice when something's happening? Well, it requires you to slow things down and start to pay attention. When those emotions if you're finding yourself having an emotional reaction, or you get a little bit uncomfortable, or you sense something isn't right, whether it's after the fact, a week later, an hour later, 10 minutes ago, something happened, it's about starting to notice those so that you can start to pick up on those patterns. And if you can pick up on those patterns, the time that you notice it happening will get closer and closer and closer to the moment when it's actually happening. And by paying attention to that, we can develop something that we call real-time awareness. Real-time awareness is the ability to notice that you're having a reaction in the moment. In the context of unconscious bias, that you might be demonstrating a behavior in the moment, or you're about to, that is inconsistent with what you mean to. So how does this work? Well, first of all, we're going to go back to these brain images. Everything starts the same way. So the thing happens, we hear something, we see something, we do something. Our lizard brain may or may not be triggered. The fight, flight, freeze can be fear, sweaty palms, racing pulse, or it could be excitement, sweaty palms and racing blood pressure. It's not necessarily negative, that reaction. But what we want to do is we want to slow things down. We want to check and see how things are happening. What am I thinking in this moment? That brings it into conscious awareness. What emotions am I feeling in this moment? Remember, more in the subconscious, bringing it into conscious awareness. How are these emotions affecting me physically? Bringing that into our consciousness. How might all of this be affecting my behavior? Bringing that into our consciousness. It takes practice to create conscious awareness from some things that we're automatically doing, and that's the muscle we want to build. Think about driving. I talked about earlier driving on autopilot. You could drive someplace without knowing it because we've just done it so much it's ingrained. Well, you become very aware of what's happening when you're driving in a storm. You're paying attention to the weather conditions. You're watching the other cars. You might not even be able to listen to music. You got to turn it off. And so this is an example of something we normally can do without thinking about it, but all of a sudden we're paying attention to. So when we do this, though, it gives us an opportunity to really think about what it is we are intending to do so that we can express, hopefully, convey our intention. So we'll use words, we'll use actions, we'll use body language expressions to reinforce what we are intending to say. So we don't say something and then say, "Ooh, that is not what I intended. That is not what I meant." When we do that, then our words, our actions, and our behaviors can be aligned. Word choice, mannerism, expression, and also the decision process, the factors we evaluate when making a decision. So this is really about moving into awareness and developing self-awareness. This is what we're trying to do. As I said at the top, we're not trying to eliminate bias. What we're trying to do is understand where it might show up and develop self-awareness to hopefully interrupt when we can and where we can the impact of bias on our everyday actions, decisions, and so on. So how do you develop self-awareness? There are a lot of strategies here. I just dropped a couple here on the slide because self-reflection is about understanding our emotions and what's affecting them or what's creating or triggering them. Journaling might be a way to recall what you did during the day and start to notice those patterns. Seeking feedback. You could do a 360-degree evaluation. If you're going to ask a trusted friend, you can't be offended by what they say. You got to create a safe space. So I don't know if that works for everybody. Mindfulness is the practice of noticing what's happening and trying to clear your mind of the noise and the judgment that goes along with our thoughts. So before we get to the final questions, I just want to share then some final thoughts. Really, this is about being present. This is about slowing down our thinking, paying attention to those internal communications, ongoing self-exploration. You know, self-awareness is a journey. It is not a destination. And as we can develop that self-awareness, we can start to interrupt where possible, or at least mitigate what the impact of unconscious bias, because we're pulling more things into our consciousness. We're never going to get rid of it, but we're trying to mitigate its impact. All right, so I am going to, let's launch that fourth polling question. And while we do, I'm going to start scanning the Q&A.
There are several questions that have come in, Jana. I have launched that fourth poll. I'll let you take a look. And if we don't get to all of the questions today, you will get a report with everything that wasn't answered.
Is there anything that does not have a negative bias? You know, what's interesting is bias doesn't necessarily mean it's a negative result. What it means is it's an automatic process that we're thinking about. So remember those tendencies where we might favor somebody. It seems like a good thing when in fact there is a bias at play, which means we maybe aren't being as objective. Is our upbringing the source of our bias? Our upbringing is part of what has wired those automatic processes. Messages, faith, teaching, family practices, or habits, things like that. Is gender bias related to the perceived proper gender roles? It is absolutely related in the sense that we have societal norms for what we believe women do, what we believe men do, what the role they play in the workplace, in society, in the home. And when we don't match and sync up with those, then we get this idea that our brain has that disconnect between what we're seeing and what we believe, although we're not conscious of that. And that's where the bias shows up. How would you contrast a bias with a belief? With a belief, what is generally happening is you are more conscious of and making a decision around something because of your beliefs, where a bias is that belief is so deeply rooted. And I don't mean this in terms of faith or religion, I mean in terms of cause and effect, impact, role, etc. That is not allowing us to bring into our consciousness those things that are driving a decision in the moment. What is code switching? Code switching is changing your words, your actions, your behaviors in order to fit in with the group. It might be, for example, trying to hide an accent. It might be a common example you hear is people change their hair so that their hair meets this expectation of professional. We've seen a lot more conversations around that. Black hair, I'm talking about that because I'm Black, but somebody with dreadlocks, somebody who's from another country that has frizzier hair. alopecia, you know, women who have lost their hair. It's one thing for a man to be bald, but for a woman to be bald, you know, trying to cover those things up as much as possible and fit in, that's code switching. And it might mean you're changing a lot of things about yourself. How does meditation and mindfulness play into understanding your unconscious bias? Meditation and mindfulness isn't about understanding bias. That is about increasing our self-awareness. And when we can start to increase our self-awareness, get present in the moment and start to see the connection between what's happening and how we're responding to what's happening, we have a chance at noticing what bias is at play. So that's the idea of self-awareness. It's trying to get to that presence where we can start to identify those patterns and as a result, minimize bias. We are never going to eliminate bias. I can't say that enough. All right, Beryl, I know we're at the end of time. Thank you so much, everybody. I will get the copies of the questions. And so if I don't get to it, you're also welcome to reach out to me. My contact information is in the slides.